Hello and welcome everyone. This is Funsuk, and today I'm going to talk about the theory of suicide by Emile Durkheim. So, what is suicide? Generally, the term suicide means it is the act or an instant of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally. A person who commits or attempts suicide. So, before moving forward, let's know who Emile Durkheim is. He was an he was a French sociologist and who was born in April 15, 1858 and died on November 15, 1917 in Paris. And in his book called Lee Suicide 1897, he defines suicide as suicide refers to the every case of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative death performed by the victim himself and which strives to produce this result. And his theory of suicide is based on statistical data that were collected from various countries in Europe. And he proved that suicide cannot be explained through psychological, geographical, climate, and hereditary factors, and etc. He claimed that suicide is not an individual phenomenon, but rather a social factor such as social integration, regulation on how individuals attach or detach, and over-regulated or under-regulated by society. If these functions break down, the individuals will lose their self control, which leads to increase the chances of suicide. And he developed four types of suicide as egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. What is egoistic suicide? The suicide that take place as a result of extreme loneliness, where there is too little social integrations. If an individual feels totally detached from the social group he belongs to, then it will lead to egoistic suicide. Like, for example, drug addictions. These are the practical example for this suicide because they have poor social integration among family, friends, and without any supports, they commit suicide from failure and depression. Okay, altruistic suicide. This kind of suicide takes place when there is extreme level of social integrations. People belong to same group having common purpose, either good or bad, sacrifice their life for the group. For example, suicide bomber, terrorist organization, sati systems, and etc. Now, anomic suicide. This type of suicide occurs when the social regulation is low, increase in suicide during economic boom or bust. It occurs during high level of stress and frustrations. Now, fatalistic suicide. It is a type of suicide when uh, it happens when a person is overly regulated in the society by the societal norms and values. Too much of anything is good for nothing. So, suicide of slave out of hopelessness. These are it is one of the example of fatalistic suicide. Now, by looking at this figure, you will understand Durkheim has divided the four types of suicide, and he has divided the suicide into four groups where he has talked about too much integrations, talk about the integration, social integrations, and the social regulations, where you can see that altruistic suicide and egoistic suicide, when it happens when there is like egoistic happens when there is not enough integrations, and altruistic is just opposite to that, too much of integrations. And anomic suicide and the fatalistic suicide, these are the opposite, where like anomic suicide happens when there is not enough regulations, and the fatalistic suicide is the opposite of anomic suicide. It happens when too much of regulations. Now, conclusion of Durkheim's search. So, uh, Durkheim has mentioned that males have greater suicidal tendency as compared to females, and the rate of suicide is found more among the bachelors as marriage protects individual against suicide by integrating individuals into stable social relations. The third one is underdeveloped countries have less rate of suicide than developed countries. And number four is Protestants commit more suicide than Catholics. Now, the critiques on suicide theory of Emile Durkheim. So, Durkheim has failed to talk about the role of economic in suicide rate. He failed to talk about the money, that money might also be a reason behind suicide at that era. Number second is he also failed to focus on crimes and suicide rate because people often were tied up with crimes, especially rape, murder, homicide. These conditions also support to increase the suicide rate. He gave more priority to the role of religion in his study of suicide, and Durkheim concerned the cause of suicide only with social facts and rejected the relationship between suicide and personality in terms of psychology as well as alcoholism. Suicide is not an easy act like other action, so considering only the society's regulation and integrations, one cannot always go for extreme decision. There should be some personal drives to sacrifice one's life. So he failed to focus on the subjective factors. He excluded the subjective factors. So, viewing the suicide rate among Catholics and Protestants, one cannot draw a conclusion that too low social integration leads to egoistic suicide and etc. So, these are the critiques on suicide theory of Emile Durkheim. Thank you for listening.